Oh, right. Sharing everything.
Yeah, I know.
See. Okay. Gonna get it started.
Hello. Hey, Hank. Hank.
Hello. Sorry.
Hello. If you're here for the SACM meeting, please stay and sit down. And if you're not, can you please leave? Not meaning to be rude, but. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karsten. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and get started. We have 1 hour to finish up before they kick us out of here. Do we have scribe? What was the deal with scribes? Do we have a scribe? Do we have anybody who's willing to be Jabber scribe? Who took? You don't have. You can take notes? Okay, so Dave, you'll take notes. So we still need a Jabber scribe. I imagine it'll be a very low volume Jabber scribe, but if somebody could please volunteer to do that. Anybody? Anybody? Not really. Okay. Okay. So we basically have two things on the agenda today. The first one is terminology, and then the second one is we're going to hear back from the folks that worked yesterday on the information model. So if we could go ahead and start with Hank. Speak up. Noise is louder than that. Well, I can't help.
Okay, hi, I'm Hank, and I will not give you a actual report today about things that have been done because that's happened at the last virtual interim. Today we will look at a few terminology and terms that are in the queue and about to be processed. This is also connected somehow, of course, to the work we did yesterday on the information model. So next slide. Yeah, this is just to reiterate what's this about. The terminology is a complementary task that aligns inconsistencies across drafts. This task will end when SACM is done, I think, maybe a little bit before that. And yeah, every draft in the end will benefit from this endeavor. Next slide. We have a specific at some specific points in drafts, like the information model and the terminology and the architecture, the indication that the information model is about data in motion and not actually about data in rest. That's the current understanding. I think this is going to be an issue on the terminology, because I don't think that everybody will agree. And from the top of my head, I think if Jim would be in the room, he would object. So we have to clarify on this. It is most certainly about data in motion, but somehow it's also about data in rest. And we have to define these terms, put them in the architecture, I guess, as a plan, and then be sure about what we're doing here. So this will be an addition to the ID. This will, of course, sharpen focus. That does not correct. Go ahead. No problem. You've actually did good. Yeah, unfortunately, we have a question on data model again, and this is an issue we have to resolve. Please do not throw a stone at me. It's a very simple issue. It is not a showstopper. It can be decided why we go on. But the idea that after the presentation on Wednesday, that the information model, for example, could somehow subsume fields of the SWIT standard definition, and there are two representation formats for SWITs at the moment, which are XML and the upcoming concise representation in CBOR, and that those are basically the same data model. I don't know that everybody agrees on that, so I will just put basically that question in the issue tracker: are those two representations the same or different data models? And then while we just proceed and resolve that question, which is open, I think we can solve that. And the underlying notion is, I think, that's just a different serialization, not a different data model, and I'm not sure about this. So again, we have to define serialization in context to data models and then be done with that. That's just a task. It's not a showstopper. Next slide, please. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Doesn't seem to be so. Dave tries to make a comment, and we will hear from him soon, I guess.
Okay. AV guy in the back.
This one's looks like it's on. Can anyone hear me? Yeah?
More on.
Dave Woltermeyer. So I think I raised I had a little back and forth with Jim on this, and I think we brought this conversation up in the context of SQUID tags and different bindings. So things like CBOR and XML are definitely different, serialization methods. I think the challenge with purely, and while they're different serialization methods, they effectively implement the same data model. I think the challenge that we run into is there are processing requirements around XML signatures or CBOR signatures that vary slightly. So even though the serializations are effectively implementing the same data model, there's slightly different processing requirements that need to be invoked in order to properly sign a SQUID tag and validate a signature. And so it's important that the distinction that we're making between data models and serialization allows for some flexibility in how we handle some of those operational kinds of considerations.
Yeah. I think a concise comment on the issue I will raise would be in order. So Dave, if you would then just start the discussion and maybe even wrapping it up with a one sentence. Oh. I made him go back again.
So I already did raise it on the list. No one else has commented. So I would first like to see people chime in saying, yeah, okay, this is right, or no, this is wrong. Haven't seen that yet.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Dave, can you just bring that microphone up to here? Or?
Okay, next slide, please.
Oh.
I will add clarification to the existing definition of information model to say that the purpose is to differentiate different data models, which again was more clear a few days ago than it is now, but it will be clear again. And it is introducing a second vocabulary, which is a new term that will be added to the information model. And we will not use every imaginable data information element out there. We will concentrate and focus on the things you want to ask about. For example, a good example is, of course, a query. If you have a query in a second domain to retrieve some more complex data, you have to at least have a hook that you can identify a specific set of items that you're interested in. So those are most certainly, those queries are most certainly based on fields or data elements that are defined in other representations, for example, SWIDs. And so you have to have a common understanding in the second domain how to retrieve and ask for them. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, the definition of a second domain is a little fuzzy at its edges. There is still the open question of if an internal collector is actually a part of the second domain or is it not. To highlight this, an internal collector, it resides on the target endpoint. It's basically software the owner put there and that is able, for example, to self-report. And there are notions that this should be not a part of the second domain, and there are notions that this should be a second component. So maybe it's both. It has to be defined in order to make a complete definition here, I think. So my proposal is that the editor and authors of the existing drafts might maybe agree on this and then go on. Yeah, that's basically the thing. Next slide, please. In contrast to being a target endpoint, there's now a kind of designation that you can associate it with basically every endpoint, and that's the excluded endpoint. A target endpoints that you specifically do not want to access, basically. So they're not the target endpoints anymore, but excluded endpoints. And every endpoint by default is a target endpoint, but the second components, endpoints that contain second components are an exception from this rule, but then again could, for example, maybe made accessible by explicitly highlighting those target endpoints. That's a mechanism we haven't talked about yet a lot, so there's no technical understanding how this could look like in the end, but maybe it's feasible to highlight this early on, so there can be some solution for this in the end. This will be included in the existing definition of the excluded endpoint, and an issue will be raised on the GitHub. Next slide, please. Next slide, sorry. I added a definition of management plane to the terminology, which is new. There aren't any very well-written definition out there that I could find. If you have a comment on this, if you're interested in what's different between a control plane and management plane, just have a look at the terminology. Maybe shake your head, write to the list, this is wrong, it should be that. So please review and comment, especially this definition, because that would be the first definition of management plane, I think, happens in the IETF. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm just bad at Googling. So this specific item, I would recommend everybody in the room and on the list and in the work group to look at, please. Because it's beyond SACM, this definition, I guess. Next slide, please. Yeah, yesterday we looked at the introduction of the information model and found a list of tasks. These were a little bit outdated, not taking into account our current development, and now we have a new list of tasks, which is the preliminary, and Danny will elaborate on in the next slot. So this is just a list that will at some point in time update or add items. Oh, next slide, please. Update or add items in the terminology. So basically, those tasks are actually based on and taking into account the use cases that are defined in RFC 7632. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah. I make comments for myself sometimes. Yeah, I think that wraps it up quite efficiently. There's a liaison report, a small one, the terminology draft of the I2NSF working group and the SACM terminology draft will start to align. I made contact with Sue and John, and we'll meet John, I think, after the session, and we will start working on this so that we do not have at least contradicting definitions or point at each other. That's already decided in the I2NSF work group, and if nobody is actually really voicing a concern about having a more consistent cross-working group terminology, then we will continue with this endeavor. And that does not seem to be the case.
Any questions on the terminology work? Can I just ask you, and you might have told me this and I've forgotten, but it is Friday after all. What's the timeline for this? Like, what are the next steps? How close
typically, this is targeted, everything I just highlighted is targeted for the next virtual interim.
So how close is the next version of the draft to being the last version of the draft?
Sorry again.
How close is the next version of the draft to being the last version of the draft?
I think it's about 90% complete. It depends. It actually depends on how fast moving the other drafts are still. If there is an overhaul in the essential one, it would not be the last draft, but the next draft is supposedly really stable. We could make a call on it maybe. My personal feeling is that will be in 2 iterations will be the last draft, because the next iteration might just have some nits in it still. It's typically the case.
So this, Adam, I think the original intent was to keep it open as long as we needed to, so that as we did new work, any terms that needed to be put into it would stay.
Yeah, it is an ongoing task, but having something stable in here that somehow is not prescriptive and normative by itself, but in this working group forces people to use that terminology. This forces is not very, I mean this in a good way, is good. So having it stable as soon as possible, maybe even before some of the drafts adapt the terminology, is a good thing, because I have a guideline. And that's maybe speeding things up.
Dave Waltermeyer. So as we're addressing new drafts incrementally, we might want to update the terminology draft. But along the lines of this conversation, it would be probably good to do a working group last call on the draft. Once we get it to a stable state, park it until we need to update it again. Mm-hmm. Use that as a way of drawing a line in the sand, essentially, based on the current terminology.
Yeah, that's actually the point I was getting to, was at what point do we agree on the terms that are in there now?
Yeah.
And then if we need to add to them, that would be great. But we need consensus that these are the terms we're going to use, and these are the way these terms are defined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's possible. I think last draft, for the next iteration, last draft might be a little bit tight, but again, it's at the end of the tunnel, the light. Okay, if there's no other questions, then I will release this square for Danny.
All right, all set? Yeah, cool. So sorry just to disappoint. I'm probably not going to talk about the tasks because Hank ended up talking about them, so I kind of took them out of the slides, but it's all right. Yeah, no, we got mixed up there. But so anyways, I just wanted to give a quick update on what we've done since the last session. I can go to the next slide. Basically kind of broken down to 2 things. We had a breakout session on Wednesday after the SACM meeting where we discussed a variety of different information model topics. And then Hank, Nancy, and I worked to kind of start merging together the text between the text they provided in the information model that they submitted on like March 21st, and then the current working group information model. So we can go to the next slide. So basically for the breakout session, most of this, it's all on the list, but I just figured I'd highlight the main points that were kind of covered. So one of the big things, as Hank mentioned, is kind of just resolving whether or not SACM discusses information in motion versus, or data in motion versus data at rest. Kind of currently thinking that the SACM deals with the data in motion, and then it's up to implementers to decide how they store that information, with the understanding that they, SACM components can push information and get information from the data stores in some standardized way. As far as, so we had, between the two information models, we had a couple different names for some of the core constructs. There was attribute and atomic information element, and kind of out of the working group breakout session, we decided that attribute was a good name that we could keep. And then we also had object and composite information element, and actually out of the breakout session, it was kind of decided, at least, as a proposal to the working group, that maybe subject would be a better option. And I guess there's a slight difference in how subject's defined. It's basically a name with essentially a collection of attributes or other subjects associated with it. And that's actually, that new definition's in the revised individual draft, and that'll be sent out to the list for kind of discussion and see if it makes sense to everyone. And then there's also some discussion around SACM content elements and statements, and this was something new in the individual draft information model, and I think this is something that we need to further discuss as a group, and I think we can do that on the list. And then lastly, there was some agreement around the fact that, attributes, depending on how they're used in the organization they're used in, may or may not identify and target endpoint. And we really need to leave it up to the organizations to make that determination, and they can use things like guidance to kind of configure what makes sense for their enterprise. And then lastly, just so kind of with that in mind, just having a placeholder where they can just put what they want is kind of maybe the way to go. And there's kind of some ongoing discussion with that on the list as well. Next slide. So basically, the approach we took with the information model merger was, because it's a lot easier just to update an information or individual draft, we basically took text from the current information model from the working group one and copied it over into the individual draft, and kind of just worked together to kind of combine it and revise it so we're both happy with it. And basically what we did then is kind of point out, where does this information now go in the current working group information model? And basically we want to put all those kind of decisions out to the group to look at and make a decision on. So next slide. So basically I just wanted to kind of highlight the key areas and things that the decisions that the group needs to make. And once the updated individual draft's up on the working group page, we can point to that, and we already have the working group document up there, and people can actually look at the text and see what they think, and provide any feedback that they want. So basically, the abstract in the working group document was just a single line saying, here's the information model for the SACM working group. It provides a little bit more information, kind of talking about how it defines the information needs for SACM, kind of that are based on the use cases that SACM defined. That text is pretty much, I think, ready to go, and just needs to be considered whether or not everyone's happy with it, and we can pull it in if that makes sense. And the introduction is the same way. That text is ready to go as well. Information elements, section 3 in the individual draft is going to be a new section in the working group draft, and it's going to go between the current sections 2 and 3, and it really just talks about kind of what an information element is and why we have it within SACM. And then the last, I guess, section 4 is kind of aligns with what we had as kind of the information model framework, which I think we're going to actually change the name of that to structure. But really, there's some kind of text in that beginning of section 4 that aligns with basically attributes, objects, and metadata. Objects is actually now subject now, if the group's okay with that. But that's going to kind of be pulled in there. And then obviously, or I guess in the working group draft, we also have some subsections explaining, how to use the IPFix syntax with respect to attributes and objects. We'll keep that in there, even though we're going to change some of the text, kind of describing what the different structures are. Next slide. So then, as I mentioned before, I think there's some more discussion we have to have with SACM statements and content elements. So I think really before we consider whether or not we merge that text in, I think we have to just decide whether it's needed and if the group agrees with the text. So that's more of a, we have to just kind of send that out for feedback. Relationships and events, those are sections in both information models. And I know at least, well, in the current information model, it's pretty sparse, the information that's actually in there. So I think we need to better understand what we mean by those things before we can determine whether or not this text should be merged in as well. And then lastly, the information element vocabulary is basically just a list of different information elements, and we need to consider them to see whether or not we want to pull them in. And if we do, basically just have to convert them to the IPFix syntax, and we can drop them in section 5 of the current information model. And next slide. And then, so yeah, with that, that's pretty much the update. Basically, I see kind of the next step is taking these different actions and posing the different questions to the list, noting the different sections in the individual draft and the working group draft, and then go from there based on the working group discussion.
So the only question I really have is, without trying to put you on the spot, is sort of time frame for the next update, or?
Yeah, so I think so those first few items in the table, those are rated, I think, have a decision be made whether or not they should be included. So as soon as we have the updated draft where people can, the updated individual draft where people can look at the revised text, I think we can just send out emails to the list saying, okay, here's the new text. What do you guys think? If everyone's okay with it, we can pull it up.
And so you or somebody from that breakout team is going to send those messages?
Yeah, we can do that. And I think we could probably do that within, today or next week.
Okay.
And then after that, some of the other things need a little more discussion, but I don't see why we can't kick those off now and hopefully continue to make progress where we can make a determination as to whether or not we should pull that stuff in.
Okay. Are there any other questions about the work they did? Okay.
That's it. Thanks.
Thank you. What did you say? Yeah. Oh, wait. Oh, look, wait for it. So the last thing on the agenda was for us to discuss a way forward, which is TBD. It's TBD, so we didn't actually fill that part out. Anyway, I think we talked specifically this week about a small set of documents. We want to have 2 interims between now and 2 interims between now. Do we have target dates for those, or? I think we're all suffering from sort of the Friday morning blues here. So potentially the week of May 16th and the week of June 20th is what we're currently looking at. Is anybody aware of major conflicts for those weeks at this point. Week of May 16th or the week of June 20th. Obviously, we'll reconfirm this on the list and we'll set up doodle polls for specific in those time slots. I just want to know if there's a, like, the publishing cutoff for Berlin is July 8th. Right. Okay. So nobody's aware of any major constraints for those two specific weeks?
The TCG meeting conflicts on the 20th, June 20th.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
TCG meeting conflicts with the June 20th.
Up a week being, we can move it sooner by 1 week. So is the week of June 13th any better? Of course, I actually can't look at my calendar at the moment, so. I mean, obviously there's a number of our participants who aren't here, so we'll take this to the list, but the bottom line for the way forward is we have 2 interims between now and the Berlin meeting. We'll have a merged information model by the time of the Berlin meeting. We're going to do the call for the adoption on SWID, vulnerability analysis. Yeah, why don't you do that?
Yeah, so information model, we'll work on getting that fully merged before 96. Is that a good target? Yep. Get the information model merged and close to, as far as we can progress it by 96. I mean, ideally, I'd like to be able to have it support the vulnerability assessment scenario, which also I think we should work on in, the meantime. We have a call on the SWID document that we're going to put out, the call for adoption on that. A couple of other, I guess, administrative things for that I guess qualify for way forward, but we're going to reevaluate the list of conflicts that we have in this group so that it's easier to schedule 2 sessions wider apart in future meetings. So be on the lookout for that. I guess we'll probably concentrate on chairs and, critical authors, critical editors. And the other thing to talk about is how we use GitHub. So up till now, we've been doing 1 GitHub repository per draft. And there were a few options to look at. Should we move to having one GitHub repository for all the drafts, 1 per draft, or perhaps 1 repository for related drafts. And our present thinking at this point is that we'll use 1 GitHub repository for related drafts. To kind of help, excuse me, prove this out, we've created a vulnerability scenario repository that will hold, it actually already has the existing vulnerability repository, vulnerability assessment draft in it. But it can also hold additional drafts related to that scenario. So for example, if we do need to create a vulnerability detection data format, that could go in that same repository. We'll put this out on the list as well, but I kind of wanted to get a sense in the room for any objection to having 1 repository for related drafts. I see Danny. Uh-oh.
So I just have a question. You wouldn't be sticking like SWID messages in there, right?
What's that?
You wouldn't stick like SWID messages and attributes in there, in the SWID or in the vulnerability assessment scenario?
There might be a separate repository for that, for related things about endpoint identification or identification elements or something like that.
Yeah, it's just, I just wanted to make sure we weren't putting like solutions that may be applicable beyond vulnerability assessment scenario just in there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's kind of the idea, I think. So, okay, no, it doesn't look like there's any serious objection to that in the room. So mention it on the list, and if anybody complains a lot, we'll hash it out.
This is Hank. Sorry, I have a question. So what I hear from this is that we might end up with 2 repositories. One of them includes the, I don't know, stuff that originates from the SACM work group. The other one that with solutions that are then adopted as SACM solutions. Is this correct? This looks like a schism a little bit, like that's not really SACM, they're just a little bit more, I don't know. No, I just thought that maybe I understood it wrong.
I can't hear you.
can't
That's the
hear you.
problem.
You can't hear me? Oh,
That's better.
thank you. You couldn't hear me? That's new to me. As how I understood it, you want to do 2 repositories?
We have one account, SACM-WG, that
Yeah.
has multiple repositories.
Yeah, that's the current state, yes.
Yes.
And then the planned
The
state?
ones that we already have will stay in place. There's no reason to move them yet.
Oh, okay. Then I
Yes.
retract my comments. Thank you.
Okay. Yep. That's, no, that's,
It's so loud with him. It's like, all right. Are there any other comments? Anything else? Any other business for today? All right. Well, you have 20. Oh, Dave.
I was just going to say, this is Dave Woltermeyer. We're hoping to move quickly on getting to a working group last call on the vulnerability assessment scenario. I think that'll be largely driven by the amount of discussion and feedback that we get on the draft. But if we can get a good amount of discussion, I think we would like to have a working group last call before Berlin, if we can get there.
yeah, I agree. I submitted a pull request to the vulnerability scenario this morning, or technically this afternoon. You might look at it because I created a related issue as well that just said there was a lot of stuff I wanted to see improved, so I just did a pull request. So we should review that, have some discussion about it, and hopefully it clarified, made it a little shorter, more concise.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And that was as contributor. I don't know if I have to say that or not, but
All right. Anything else? All right. We're adjourned.
thanks everyone. Blue sheets.
How do you want us? We can just start back on.
Anybody can look at the pull request. They can go ahead and build it into something that they can read. Read it. All the data descriptions that were in line, because that all just came with a nice fancy table at the end. It basically said, see the table. We can change that back if we want to, but what I really wanted to get to is a common way to talk about vulnerability assessment. Capabilities are required in the assessment. And then we look at the data table, which actually still needs to be updated. I didn't update any headers or anything like that, but I did. I came up with the
the security